Now in this video we're going to have a look at the structural organization of the human body. Now this is a big task that we've taken on board today, and hopefully we can get it sorted in about 10 minutes or so. But what we need to do is we need to have a look at the human body and we need to break it down into its components until we get all the way down to its smallest structure. Now the smallest structure we're going to look at today is atom. Now atom by its name means indivisible, so we're going to stop there, or we're going to start there and go from atom all the way up to human body. Now something you need to be aware of is that the human body is made up of a number of complex systems that interact with one another. So these systems, there's 11 of them, include the digestive system, cardiovascular system, renal system, reproductive system, nervous system. I won't go through all of them, mainly because I'll probably forget some. Made up of all these systems coming together, but these systems by themselves are made up of tissues. And these tissues are made up of cells, and these cells are made up of organelles, and these organelles are made up of molecules, and these molecules are made up of elements, which are made up of atoms. Okay? So what I want to do is start at the atomic level and build our way up. Now that means we have to talk a little bit of chemistry, so I apologize, but I promise you it's worth it. If you understand what I'm about to go through in regards to chemistry, in regards to anatomy and physiology, I won't say it's all you need to know, but it's a very, very good start. So, what do I have up here? I've got a very dodgy drawing of the periodic table. Now, we've all seen the periodic table hanging up in our chemistry high school class. We looked at it, maybe knew, maybe didn't know what it was referring to, but we knew it was boring. But let's refer to it and always bring the relevance back to the human body. So, the periodic table is made up of atoms. That's the first thing you need to know, and you need to know what an atom actually is. So, if I were to draw up an atom, it's got a couple of important parts you need to know. It's very simple. One is it's got a nucleus, and in this nucleus we have something called a proton, which is positively charged, and something called a neutron, which has no charge at all. And then flying around this nucleus we have an electron, which is negatively charged. This electron is shooting its way around. Now, what I've drawn up here is an atom that has one proton, one electron. Now, when it comes to chemistry, all we really care about is that electron, okay? Because chemistry, talking about atoms coming together to form molecules, is all about the arrangement of these electrons. Now, you can have atoms with one electron, two electrons, three electrons, four, and so forth, all the way down. And this is pretty much what the periodic table reflects. Now, when you have an atom like this where we've got one proton, which is positively charged, and one electron, which is negatively charged, that is the very first atom on the periodic table, and the very first atom on the periodic table is hydrogen. That's what the 1 stands for. Now, atoms are neutral. That means they have no overall charge to them, no net charge. And the reason why is, obviously a neutron has no charge, so we don't need to take that into consideration. Proton has a positive charge and electron has a negative charge, so they cancel each other out. So what that means is, with hydrogen being 1, there's 1 electron, 1 proton. With helium being number 2, what do you think it's going to have? It's going to have 2 electrons and 2 protons. And then that's hydrogen, helium, then we're going to have lithium, 3 protons, 3 electrons, beryllium, 4, and so forth. So that's the basic structure of the atom. Now, why do you care in regards to biology? Well, let's go back a little bit further in time, because we need to, I think it's important that you are aware of where these atoms actually originate from and where they come from. So, in the beginning, whatever you believe, Big Bang, God, whatever it may be, both, in the beginning there was hydrogen and helium as a gas floating through that infinite void of space. Now, hydrogen and helium are atoms, and they were forming these atomic clouds. Okay, so just clouds like you'd see in the sky, similar to, and these hydrogen and helium atoms were coming together. Why? Because gravity likes to pull things towards each other. So over time, a lot of time, hydrogen and helium would come together and coalesce. Now, as they'll coalesce, more and more would be dragged towards them, and what you'd find is they'd start to form a ball. Now, with this this ball, which is basically a cloud of hydrogen and helium, it would become most dense in the middle. So there'd be a higher concentration of stuff deep in the core of this cloud. And as it starts to grow and grow and grow, that core gets so dense that there's actually a huge amount of pressure inside of that cloud. Now this cloud is now called a star. So stars are just a coalescence of gases such as hydrogen and helium coming together, bringing all those atoms together, especially right in the center of that star. Now, a couple of things are happening here. As it becomes so dense, what you're doing is pushing hydrogens together, pushing heliums together, and pushing hydrogen and heliums together. Now, when you look at that atom, you've got that electron floating around the outside and the proton in the middle. Now, it takes a lot to really start pushing them together, okay? At first, they're going to repel. But what can happen is when you push them really closely together, the protons want to come together and they start to fuse. And this is a fusion reaction, which you've probably heard of before. Now, when you do this fusion reaction, it is more complex than it sounds, and I'm not an astrophysicist. I'm telling you a very simple version of this. When you fuse these atoms together, if you fuse 2 hydrogen together, you're going to have 2 protons and 2 electrons. And what's that called? That's called a helium. What if you were to fuse 2 helium together? So that's 2 and 2 equals 4. What's the 4th element? Beryllium. And so forth. So as you start to fuse these atoms together in the core of this star, in the guts of the star, it starts to create heavier and heavier atoms of the periodic table. Okay? Now, if you've got a group of atoms, it's called an element. So I'm going to start referring to them as elements when I'm referring to them in big groups. So now we've smushed together hydrogen, created helium, pushed together helium, we've created beryllium, pushed together hydrogen and helium, we've created lithium, and so we're starting to create heavier and heavier elements. Now, these elements are still stuck in the core of that star. So how do they get away from the core of the star and come into and become us? Well, what happens is you've got 2 opposing forces. As they come together by gravity, they fuse, and when they fuse, they release energy. And when they release energy, that's an outward explosion. So you've got an inward pull of gravity, fusing them together, and then an outward explosion of energy. And this energy is going to be heat and light, as an example, okay? So stars are constantly going in, out, in, out, in, out. Now, the point is this. Once you hit heavy elements, so once you start hitting the metals, for example, or even the heavier metals, such as these ones in here, right? What happens is you don't have enough pressure to fuse them together, okay? Now, that means that you've got the inward gravitational pull, but you don't have the fusion, which means you don't have the outwards explosion, which means all you have is an inward pull, and this star gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until the gravity and that pressure inside the core of that star is so strong that it explodes. And this is what can be called a supernova if the star's large enough. Now, this explosion is what forms all these other heavier elements of the periodic table. And that means everything that was inside that star, the hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, is basically spewed across the galaxy. Now, what do you think happens with these elements and atoms that are spewed across the galaxy? Well, over time, they start to coalesce again and they can form planets. And these planets may be littered with all these atoms, such as Earth. And that's why Earth contains all these atoms, because they've actually been spewed out from the core of a star. And that means that every single atom inside of your body and my body came from the core of a star. So when you hear Carl Sagan say you are star stuff, you are literally star stuff. You are made up of atoms and elements that have formed in the core of a star. Now, what's this got to do with biology? Well, our human body is made up of pretty much only a couple of these. It's made up of hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus. They pretty much make up 99% of the human body. So the building blocks, the basic building blocks of us, hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus. Okay? Oh, and where is it? Calcium as well. This creates 99% of us. Now, there are other trace elements in our body, and this creates less than 1%, and this is going to be sodium and magnesium and potassium and so forth, okay? But these are the majority. Now, how do these atoms create us? Well, again, that's a big question, but first thing you need to be aware of is if you look at those atoms again, proton in the middle, electron on the outside, it's the electron that you're interested in, okay? As a chemist or biologist, it's the electron, because what you're going to find is that as the atoms are shown in the periodic table, they're shown as in their neutral form. So when the electron is balanced out with the proton. But they're not always sitting in this happy neutral form. Sometimes they don't want to be in this neutral form. Sometimes some atoms want an extra electron or two, or sometimes they want to give away that extra electron or two. So how do we know which ones want to give away what, or which ones want to take what? Well, there's the proper way to do it, and there's my way to do it. I think my way is a little bit easier. It's not as complex, but it still makes sense. So bear with me. First thing you need to be aware of is all the atoms in the periodic table on the right-hand side are known as noble gases, okay? Now, all I really care about this is that they're noble gases. They don't care about any other atoms. They're happy being themselves. So that means the amount of electrons that they are happy with. And in actual fact, they are so comfortable with who they are that all the other atoms really want to be like the noble gases. They want to be like the noble gas which is closest to them. So for example, hydrogen wants to be like helium, okay? Lithium wants to be like helium because it's only one away, right? Carbon wants to be like neon. Nitrogen wants to be like neon. Sodium wants to be like, go back one, neon as well. Now what that means is if you have a look at how many electrons they have, that's how many electrons that closest one wants to have, okay? Now our body is made up predominantly of water. It's the most common substance within our body. And what you're going to find is that sometimes you're going to be ingesting food, and when I say sometimes, I mean all the time, you'll be ingesting food, and this food starts to get broken down into basic components. Now some of these basic components will be molecules, which are atoms bound together, or they're just going to be atoms themselves. Now some of these atoms are going to have a charge to them, which means it may have an extra electron, or it has gained an electron. So let me give you a quick example, okay? Sodium has 11 electrons, but it wants to be, in order for it to be happy, it wants to be like neon, which is 10 electrons, which means sodium wants to give away an electron, okay? Wants to give away an electron. Chloride, where's chloride sit? Over here. Chloride has 17 electrons and wants to be like argon, 18 electrons. So chloride wants to gain an electron. Sodium wants to give away an electron. Chloride wants to gain an electron. What a perfect relationship. That means that sodium can give its electron to chloride. Chloride will be happy. Sodium will be happy. And now they've bound together. And what do they form? They form sodium chloride. And what do you know sodium chloride as? That is salt. So why do we have so much salt? Because it's just a perfect relationship. Sodium wants to give away that electron. Chloride wants to take that electron. Now the important point for us physiologically is when you ingest salt, see how sodium chloride has no overall charge? It's because sodium's given the one to chloride, chloride's taken it from sodium, it's happy. But once you take something like salt and ingest it, it's going to end up getting mixed up in all the water within our body. And what happens is that this sodium chloride breaks apart. Now, this salt, when it breaks apart, it's going to form, what do you think? It's going to form sodium and chloride again. But this time, it's going to form sodium without that electron and chloride with the extra electron. Does it make sense why sodium is a plus here? It's neutral with its 11, okay? But if you give away one negative thing, you're left with an extra positive thing. There we go. Chloride was neutral here in the periodic table, but it's gained an electron, so it's got an extra negative. So that means when you ingest salt, in the human body, you're left with a positive sodium and a negative chloride. These are called ions. And ions have function in the body. So for example, we need sodium in the body because sodium allows for our nerves to send electrical impulses. Chloride plays a role in this as well. So hopefully this makes sense as an important point going from atoms to ions. Okay, and again, ions are very important in the body. But we know that the body isn't just made up of atoms and ions, they're made up of more complex molecules. This is when atoms come together to form more than two connections. So what I want to go through with you is some of the most important molecules you're going to find in the body. Now, there's actually three that I want you to be aware of, three of these molecules. Now, these molecules are the three most abundant molecules in the body, and they're very, very important in allowing for your body to function adequately. So the first of which are called carbohydrates. The next is lipids, and then the last one here is proteins. Now there's another one which you could include, which is nucleic acids. I'll write it down anyway. So these are all macromolecules, big molecules. Now they're made up of smaller molecules. For example, carbohydrates are made up of something called glucose, which is a simple sugar. Lipids are made up of something called glycerol and fatty acids. Proteins are made up of amino acids. Okay, so macromolecules, carbohydrates, their micromolecule, which is glucose or glycerol or fatty acids or amino acids, are again just molecules. So they're hydrogens and carbons and oxygens and nitrogens coming together because they want to either share electrons or give electrons away or take electrons. Okay, so it's all about that sharing of electrons. Now, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, you've probably heard these as your micronutrients. This is what you ingest throughout the day. And this is very important because these macronutrients here form the cells of our body. Let me give you an example. If you take a typical cell within the body, what you're going to find is that that cell, every cell, is surrounded by what's called a phospholipid bilayer, which means you've got this double membrane layer that surrounds the cell, which is made up of a phosphate head and a fatty acid tail. So if you can picture that going all the way around the body, around the cell, okay, all the way around. So if I were to make that larger, you got a phosphate head, fatty acid tail, phosphate head, and like I said, it goes all the way around. Now, they're lipids, okay? Fatty acid tail, there's glycerol in here, and there's going to be phosphate in there as well. Okay, that's lipids making this phospholipid bilayer, but what you're also going to find is embedded in this phospholipid bilayer are carbohydrates and proteins. What's the importance of carbohydrates and proteins? Well, they're often recognized as signaling molecules. So they can be used as receptors, they can be used to bring things into the cell or tell other cells what's happening. They can tell the immune system of the body whether this cell belongs to the body or is a foreign cell. So they're all very important. So this is just one particular function of each of these carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, and that's simply with creating the phospholipid bilayer outside the cell. Inside the cell, you have subcellular structures called organelles, and there's many different types of organelles within a cell. So for example, you're going to have organelles called mitochondria. You're going to have organelles called Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulum, you're going to have lysosomes, peroxisomes, There's so many different types of subcellular structures called organelles. And basically you can think of the cell as being a city and all of these different subcellular structures as playing a role within the city to allow it to function properly. So, for example, the mitochondria create energy, so this is the power plant. Another subcellular structure is the nucleus, which contains the DNA, and DNA creates proteins, and proteins have a function. And so the nucleus could be seen as the library. It contains all the information. The Golgi apparatus packages things off and sends them away, so it could be seen as the postage agency. The endoplasmic reticulum and the rough endoplasmic reticulum can create proteins, and they can also detoxify certain substances and store substances. So it could be seen as a factory, for example. Lysosomes and peroxisomes clean up the streets by taking away substances that shouldn't be there. So again, they're all made up of molecules: carbons, oxygens, hydrogens, nitrogens, phosphorus, and so forth. Okay? Now, there's 100 trillion cells in the human body. Okay? That's a lot of cells. And cells are located in different areas and have different functions. So what determines the function of a cell in one area compared to another area? Well, it depends on the shape of the cell, how it interacts with other cells, and also how many of these and what type of these subcellular structures they have. So for example, if you take the cells of muscle tissue, okay? So muscle tissue can include skeletal muscle, that's the muscle we use to run, jump, sing, stretch, all that type of stuff. Smooth muscle, this is the muscle of our organs, so of our digestive system, the muscles of our stomach and intestines, or our cardiac muscle, the muscles of our heart. All of those cells, what they have in common are a couple of things, one of which is that they contain huge amounts of mitochondria. Why? Because muscles contract. And when a muscle contracts, it needs energy to do so, and the mitochondria creates the energy. So that's just one characterizing feature of muscle cells, is that it contains mitochondria. Now, its shape is also important as well, because if you have a look at smooth muscle, you'll find it's spindle shaped. If you have a look at skeletal muscle, you'll find that it's branched, and all of this has to do with the way it contracts and talks to other cells. Now, this really depends on where you're looking in the body. If you look in the liver, we know the liver plays a role, well, it plays hundreds of different roles, but one of which is detoxification. So any substances that are coming into the body that shouldn't be there and may be considered dangerous, it will detoxify. So basically, it will metabolically change the structure of that compound into a form that hopefully doesn't harm us. How does it do this? Well, the cells in the liver contain a huge amount of endoplasmic reticulum, which do this detoxification process. Therefore, you can determine one characteristic of liver cells as huge amounts of endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, now, these cells, what you'll find is when you have cells of similar structure, similar function, coalescing together in one area, that's called a tissue, okay? And there's a couple of different tissues in the body. So the types of tissues we have in the body is nervous tissue. This is basically the nervous system, so brain, neurons, spinal cord, and so forth. We have connective tissue. This is the tissue that binds us together, holds us into place. We have muscular tissue, and muscular tissue, like I said, allows for us to move around and so forth. So these are the different tissues of the body. And these tissues, like I said, are made up of cells that have a similar function, okay? Now, tissues, when you get these tissues coming together, and so if you get tissue that has muscle associated with it, nervous tissue associated with it, connective tissue associated with it, okay? And the last one is epithelial, which I forgot to tell you. Epithelial tissue lines the inside and outside of structures. So for example, when you're looking at me, you're looking at my epithelium. If you took an endoscope and looked down into my mouth and down my esophagus and into my stomach, you'd be looking at the epithelium of that tissue. So epithelium lines organs, connective tissue holds organs together, muscular tissue allows for movement of the body, and nervous tissue allows for communication of the body. So this is when you have similar cells forming these certain tissue types. Now when these tissues come together to work with one another, you start to form organs. Now like I said, if I take the stomach for example, and if I were to cut into the stomach and look at what's called the histology of the stomach, remember the first lecture? I said the microscopic anatomy is called histology, where you look at tissues and cells and have a look at the anatomy of them. Well, if you take the stomach and section it and have a look at the layers and the tissues of the stomach, you'll find all 4 of the major tissue types. You'll find epithelium lining the stomach. Then you're going to find connective tissue holding it together. You're going to find muscular tissue because the stomach needs to contract and relax. And you're going to find nervous tissue innervating the muscles to tell it to contract and relax, and also innervating some of the glands there that secrete those acids and enzymes that help for the digestive process. So these are organs. Now, that's the stomach. That's a single organ, but we know that the stomach doesn't work alone. The stomach has to be attached to the esophagus superiorly or proximally, and attached to the duodenum or small intestines distally. Okay, so closest to the point of entry, the mouth, or further away from the point of entry. So it's not just the stomach that works in isolation, it works with other organs. Now, when one organ works in association with other organs, these are called organ systems. So all the organs that work to allow for digestion, stomach, esophagus, mouth, tongue, small intestines, large intestines, rectum, anus, with the accessory organs such as the liver and the pancreas and the gallbladder, together they form what's called the digestive system, just as an example. Now you can think of the same with the nervous system as well. You've got the brain and the spinal cord, which is the central nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system, which is all the nerves that go out and away and come back in. So these are organ systems. Now, when organ systems all work together, it forms an organism such as yourself or myself. Now, that's a crash course, a very quick 101, starting at atoms forming in the cores in the stomachs of a star, ultimately leading up, building from atoms to elements, to molecules, to macromolecules, to cells, or to subcellular structures, then cells, and then to tissues, and then to organs, then to organ systems, and then to organisms such as human beings. So hopefully that was helpful. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. And that was a very brief overview of the structural organization of the body.